The rain had been falling since afternoon. A steady, unbroken rhythm that seemed to wash the world into shades of gray. The kind of rain that made the house feel smaller, quieter. I was sitting by the living room window with a book I wasn't really reading when the headlights swept across the front wall. My father's truck had been gone for hours, but the sound that followed wasn't his. It was heavier, slower, like the tires of a vehicle that had seen too many roads. I didn't move right away. I just listened. First the engine cut, then the slam of a door, boots on wet gravel. Dad's voice came next, loud and full of a rare kind of energy I hadn't heard in years. "Dalton, you old bastard. You made it." There was laughter, deep and genuine, spilling in through the rain. Then another voice, lower, rougher, almost a growl. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, buddy." I stood as they came in through the front door, both shaking off rain like dogs coming in from the cold. My father looked the same as always, broad shoulders, pressed flannel shirt, the faint scowl that came with every expression. But the man behind him wasn't what I expected. Captain Mark Dalton was taller than my father, lean but strong in a way that looked permanent. His hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his jaw lined with stubble that didn't seem careless so much as lived in. He carried his coat folded over one arm, water dripping from the hem. A faint scar traced his right cheek, disappearing into a week's worth of rugged shadow. And then there was his voice, gravel wrapped in warmth. "You must be the kid," he said, his eyes cutting toward me. His gaze didn't flicker or dart away like most men's. It landed, stayed, and saw. For a heartbeat too long, it was as if the air between us solidified, thick enough to feel. "Yeah," I managed, stepping forward to shake his hand. "I'm Evan." His grip was firm, military firm, but what lingered wasn't the pressure. It was the warmth, the hesitation before he let go. His skin was cold from the rain, and yet there was something steady underneath, something that made my pulse skip for reasons I couldn't name. "Mark Dalton," he said with a nod, though I already knew. My dad had mentioned him over the years, always in short, guarded sentences. "Saved my hide more times than I can count," he'd once said, and left it at that. "Evan, get the man a towel," Dad barked, already heading toward the kitchen. "We'll need another chair, too. He's staying a few nights." Mark smiled faintly, the kind of smile that softened without ever quite reaching his eyes. "Only if I'm not in the way." "Trust me," my father called back. "You're better company than this one's been lately." That earned a small laugh, low and brief, but it stayed in the room long after he stopped. I handed him a towel. He took it, fingers brushing mine again by accident, or maybe not. "Thanks, son," he said quietly. The word son landed heavier than it should have, like a weight carried on breath. My father used to call me that once. Hearing it now, from someone else's mouth, felt strangely intimate. We ate dinner together, though most of the conversation was between them. Old stories, army names, years condensed into laughter and sighs. I barely spoke, just listened, learning more about my father in an hour than I had in months. Every so often, Mark would glance my way mid-story, as if checking whether I was following. When our eyes met, it was like being pulled into something I didn't fully understand. I noticed things I shouldn't have. The way he rolled his sleeves, revealing forearms lined with faint scars and sun-darkened veins. The way he leaned back, silent, when my father spoke, respectful but detached, as if carrying ghosts no one else could see. And when he laughed, really laughed, it filled the room, shaking the walls a little. After dinner, Dad brought out beer. Mark refused at first, then gave in. They sat in the living room, clinking bottles and reminiscing about men who weren't here anymore. I stayed in the doorway, half listening, half drifting. "So what's he doing these days?" Mark asked, jerking his chin toward me. My father shrugged. "Still figuring it out. Art school dropout, part-time job at the bookstore. He's quiet." "Quiet's not bad," Mark said, his eyes flicking toward me again. "Means you're thinking before you speak." I nodded, unsure what to do with the warmth that crept up my neck. He smiled again, softer this time, then turned back to my dad. Later, when the rain thickened and thunder rolled across the valley, My father went to bed first, laughing about how these old bones can't handle beer like they used to. Mark offered to clean up. I helped him, though neither of us said much. He washed. I dried. Our shoulders brushed once when we turned at the same time. Neither of us moved away immediately. He was close enough that I could smell him. Soap, rain, a trace of smoke. Not the kind that clung to clothes, but the kind that stayed in memory. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred, but his movements were gentle, precise. When the last plate was put away, he said, "Your father's lucky. Most people don't get someone waiting at home." I didn't know what to say to that. My father didn't talk about love or waiting or much of anything that involved feeling. So I just nodded. Mark's eyes lingered, unreadable. Then, with a small sigh, he said goodnight and disappeared down the hallway toward the guest room. For a long time after, I just stood there, staring at the empty kitchen. I went to bed eventually, but sleep didn't come easy. The rain still tapped against the window, steady and patient. Somewhere downstairs, I could hear their voices again. My father's deep, slurred laugh, Mark's lower rumble in reply. I couldn't make out the words, but I could imagine them. Old memories, losses, the kind of talk men have when they think no one's listening. I turned on my side, pulling the blanket tighter. Through the hum of rain and distant conversation, one thought kept circling back, refusing to fade. The way he looked at me, not with judgment, not even curiosity, but as if he'd seen something familiar, something he recognized from his own reflection years ago. And long after their voices went quiet, that look stayed with me, replaying in the dark until sleep finally took me like a slow tide pulling me under. The next morning, sunlight broke through the rain clouds, cutting across the kitchen floor in bright, clean streaks. It was the first quiet moment I'd had since Mark arrived, and somehow, it didn't feel empty. I could still smell coffee, eggs, and something faintly metallic, like oil or steel, lingering from his presence. I found him outside, sleeves rolled up, working on the old porch railing my father had been meaning to fix for years. The boards creaked under his boots, and a cigarette burned slowly between his lips, the smoke curling into the morning air. "Your dad said this thing's been wobbling since the last storm," he said without looking up. "Can't have that. Someone could break their neck." "I told him that," I replied, stepping onto the porch. "About a year ago." He smirked around the cigarette. Guess he needed someone with a rank to tell him. That earned a small laugh from me, one I didn't expect. Mark noticed. "There it is," he said quietly, as if laughter was something rare. "You ought to do that more often." For the next hour, I handed him nails, held wood steady, fetched the screwdriver when he asked. He moved with the kind of ease that comes from muscle memory, every action precise, confident, sure. When I tried to copy the way he angled the nail, he stopped me gently. "Not like that," he said, stepping behind me. His hand covered mine, guiding the hammer. "You're letting it tilt. Keep your wrist firm." His breath brushed the back of my neck as he spoke. My pulse jumped. I focused on the wood, pretending not to feel the weight of his hand, the warmth behind me. "Like that?" I asked. He nodded once, his voice low. "Better. You've got a steady grip." He stepped away then, leaving behind the scent of sawdust and rain-damp leather. For a moment, I missed the closeness more than I wanted to admit. By midday, we sat on the steps, sweat on our foreheads, mugs of black coffee cooling between our palms. My father had gone into town, leaving us alone for the first time since Mark's arrival. "Your old man used to make me coffee in a tin cup," Mark said, gazing out at the yard. "Burned half my tongue every time." I smiled. "He still does that. Boils it like he's trying to sterilize it." Mark chuckled, the sound deep and familiar, like a distant drumbeat. "He hasn't changed much. Still the loudest man in the room. Still pretending that makes him strong." I looked at him, surprised. "You noticed that too?" He turned his head slightly, meeting my eyes. "You think I wouldn't? We all had a front row seat to that act. I think you've been living with it too long." His tone wasn't judgmental, more like understanding. caught me off guard how easily he seemed to read what no one else did. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air was warm, full of the smell of cut grass and the slow hum of cicadas. I watched the way his fingers rested around the mug, steady, strong, veins catching the sunlight. He caught me looking. It wasn't lust that passed between us. Not yet. It was something older, recognition, maybe. The quiet moment when two people realize they've been lonely in the same way. That afternoon, we worked on the old shed out back. The roof had caved in years ago, but Mark was determined to make it stand again. I followed his lead, holding the ladder, passing tools, wiping sweat from my forehead as he told stories from his army days. Stories my father had never mentioned. He used to get us lost on purpose, Mark said, hammering a nail. Said a real man should know how to find his own way back. Did it work? I asked. He laughed softly. We made it home, didn't we? The ease between us grew without either of us naming it. He started calling me kid sometimes, half habit, half teasing. The first time, I let it slide. The second time, I couldn't. I'm not a kid, I said, sharper than I intended. He froze, then smiled faintly. Fair point. For the rest of the day, he didn't call me anything. Just hey or you? Said with a half smirk that left me both annoyed and warm inside. That evening, he cooked dinner. Said he owed my father a meal. I watched from the counter as he moved around the kitchen like he'd done it 100 times. Sleeves rolled, forearms tensed with every motion. When he tasted the sauce, he handed me the spoon. Needs salt. I took a sip. Perfect. He grinned. Diplomatic answer. You'd make a decent soldier. I'd make a terrible soldier, I said. Too many questions. Not enough obedience. He laughed again, really laughed this time. Then maybe that's what the world needs more of. The next morning, he woke earlier than both of us. When I came downstairs, he was sitting on the porch again, reading an old newspaper. A thermos of coffee sat beside him, steam curling in the cool air. You're up early, I said, rubbing my eyes. Couldn't sleep, he replied. Old habit. The army trains it out of you. Sleeping in. I sat beside him. The wood was still damp from the night air, and our knees brushed when I leaned forward to pour coffee. Sorry, I murmured, shifting slightly. He didn't move. You're fine. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that fills space like a heartbeat. Steady, patient, alive. After a while, he glanced sideways. You've got your father's jawline, he said quietly. But not his eyes. What about them? They're softer, he said. More open. I looked down into my cup, unsure what to do with that. Compliments weren't something I got often, especially from men like him. The day passed in small ways. Fixing the shed door, repainting the porch rail, carrying wood to the pile behind the house. Each task brought another sliver of conversation about music, food, places he'd been. He told me about a small cafe in Belgium, about how soldiers used to drink chocolate at dawn before patrol. He spoke of loss with a kind of calm I didn't know how to match. As the sun dipped, we cleaned up, and he handed me a towel to wipe my hands. Our fingers brushed again. This time, neither of us pulled away. It was a second, maybe two, but long enough to feel it. The warmth, the quiet shock, the shared awareness of a line we were both pretending didn't exist. When he finally let go, his eyes lingered. He cleared his throat, picked up his bag of tools, and said, almost too softly, "Good work today, young man." The words hit harder than I expected. Young man, not kid, not boy. Something else, something that felt seen. I didn't say anything back, just nodded and watched him walk toward the porch light, his shoulders broad against the fading orange of evening. That night, lying in bed again, I could still feel the echo of that moment. The weight of his hand, the sound of his voice, the quiet dignity in the way he said it. He was my father's friend, a man who'd lived more life than I could imagine. But there was something in the way he looked at me that didn't belong to friendship or mentorship. It was something deeper, something unspoken, dangerous, and completely impossible to ignore. And even as I tried to close my eyes, I knew one thing for certain. I'd started waiting for the next morning. By the time dinner was over, The house felt heavier than usual. My father had worked his way through half a six-pack, telling the same army stories he always told when there was an audience who actually listened. Mark humored him, smiling in that patient way people do when they've heard the same story more times than they can count. I sat through it quietly, the clock ticking loud in the background, waiting for the part when my father would finally tire himself out. When he did, it happened fast. One moment he was laughing about some training accident in the desert, the next he was asleep in his chair, beer half finished in his hand. The television hummed softly against the quiet. Mark leaned over, gently taking the can from his old friend's fingers. "He hasn't changed much," he said with a small smile. "No," I answered. "He never really does." We stood there for a moment, the silence thickening between us. Then Mark nodded toward the back door. "Mind if I step out for a smoke?" "Go ahead," I said. But when the screen door creaked open and the cool air drifted in, I found myself following him. Outside, the night smelled of wet earth. The earlier drizzle had stopped, leaving behind puddles that reflected the faint porch light. Mark stood by the railing, cigarette glowing between his fingers, his face half in shadow. "Didn't think you smoked," I said quietly. He exhaled, the smoke trailing upward like a sigh. "Old habit. Quitting never really stuck." I leaned against the post beside him, arms folded. The porch was narrow, and the air between us felt charged, like a wire humming under too much current. "You ever serve?" he asked suddenly. I shook my head. "Dad tried to convince me once. Said it would make a man out of me." "And what did you tell him?" "That I wasn't sure I wanted to be his kind of man." Mark's laugh was low and brief, more breath than sound. "That's honest. Dangerous thing to be sometimes." "Yeah," I said. "He doesn't really appreciate honesty." He nodded, as if that confirmed something he'd already guessed. "The army didn't either. Not about everything." There was a pause then, the kind that invites questions. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated, eyes fixed on the rain-dark yard. "Let's just say the army makes it easy to keep things hidden. You follow orders, you keep your head down. Nobody asks who you really are." The way he said it made my skin tighten. His voice had changed, lower, rougher, but quieter too, as though each word weighed something. "Hide what?" I asked before I could stop myself. For a moment, the only answer was the faint crackle of the cigarette. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. Just let the question hang there between us, suspended in the damp air. Finally, he said softly, "Things that didn't fit in uniform." His tone ended the conversation as much as it began it. I didn't press, couldn't. The silence stretched on, heavy and fragile, until the first drops of rain began again, tapping softly against the roof. Mark flicked his cigarette into the yard and stepped back under the awning. "Come on," he said, motioning for me to move closer before we both got soaked. I joined him shoulder to shoulder, the smell of smoke mixing with the rain. The air felt close, almost intimate. "I didn't mean to pry," I said after a while. He shook his head. "You didn't. Some questions just don't have easy answers." We stood like that for a while, listening to the rain's rhythm on the tin roof. The sound was hypnotic, steady as breathing. Then I said, quieter, "Sometimes I wonder if my dad even sees me." Mark looked over, brows knitting slightly. I continued. "He talks at me, not to me. Everything's an order or a correction. It's like I'm invisible unless I'm doing something wrong." He said nothing at first, just watched me, the kind of look that feels like being studied but not judged. "He's proud of you," Mark said eventually. I laughed under my breath. "He's proud of what he thinks I should be, not of who I am." Mark's expression softened. "That's a hard way to live." "It is," I said, the words tumbling out before I could filter them. "You start thinking maybe you deserve it. Maybe there's something about you that makes people turn away." His gaze didn't waver. "And do you believe that?" I hesitated. "Sometimes." He sighed quietly, running a hand through his damp hair. "You shouldn't." I looked up at him, The porch light caught his face just enough for me to see the faint scar on his cheek, the lines etched by years of weather and discipline. There was something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before, a gentleness that didn't match the roughness of his voice. "I don't know what you've been told," he said softly, "but there's nothing wrong with being different, even if it means standing alone sometimes." My throat tightened. "You sound like you know what that's like." "I do," he said, almost a whisper. The rain thickened, drumming against the wood, closing us into a cocoon of sound. The world beyond the porch faded away. It was just the two of us, his quiet breath, my uneven one, the small space where our shoulders nearly touched. I don't know why I said it then. Maybe it was the rain, or the warmth of his voice, or the loneliness that had lived in me too long. "I don't think anyone's ever really listened to me before," I said. "Not like you do." He turned his head slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe you just needed someone who wasn't trying to fix you." Something inside me cracked at that. A quiet, breaking sound I could almost feel. "Mark," I started, not sure what would follow. He reached out before I could finish. His hand rested on my shoulder, firm, steady, but careful. The weight of it silenced everything in me. For a second, we didn't move. The touch wasn't a question or an answer. It was just there, warm, solid, real. When I looked up, his gaze was already on me. There was something unspoken in it. An apology, a longing, maybe both. Neither of us spoke. The rain filled the silence, beating softly against the roof, the earth, the edges of whatever it was we'd stumbled into. Then, from inside the house, a door creaked open. We both froze. Footsteps, unsteady, heavy, moved through the living room. My father's voice, groggy, mumbled something about another beer. Mark's hand dropped away. He stepped back quickly, the air rushing into the space between us like a cold wave. When the door closed again, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he said, barely audible, "You should get some sleep." I nodded, throat dry. "Yeah." He didn't look at me when I turned to go. At the doorway, I paused, glancing back. He was still standing there, watching the rain, one hand gripping the porch rail like he needed it to stay upright. The porch light painted him in muted gold, the edges of his figure blurred by the falling water. For a moment, I wanted to step back out there, to ask what he meant, to ask what this was, but I didn't. Instead, I went inside, closing the screen door softly behind me. Lying in bed later, the sound of rain on the roof carried me back to the porch. The smell of smoke, the warmth of his hand, the look in his eyes that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't desire, not exactly. It was something quieter, deeper, a recognition of the loneliness we both wore like uniforms. And as the night stretched on, I knew something had shifted, small but irreversible. The distance between us had changed. And no matter how many walls we built, part of me knew the next time our eyes met, neither of us would look away. Morning brought sunlight, but it did nothing to clear the fog that had settled between us. Everything felt just slightly off, too quiet, too careful. Even the sound of dishes in the sink seemed louder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Mark was already at the table when I came down, reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. He looked up briefly, nodded once, then went back to the print. His voice was polite, neutral. "Coffee's fresh." "Thanks." I poured a cup, sat opposite him, and pretended to read the section he wasn't. The clink of the spoon against the mug filled the space between us, steady and awkward. Every time I glanced up, he was looking somewhere else. When my father walked in a few minutes later, still groggy, he noticed right away. "What's with you two? Look like somebody died." Mark chuckled under his breath, folding the newspaper. "Just tired, I think." Dad muttered, already heading for the fridge. "Well, I hope you're not working him too hard, Mark. Kid's not used to breaking a sweat." "Actually," Mark said, looking at me now, "he's been doing fine. Better than he gives himself credit for." It was a simple sentence, but the way he said it, the softness behind the words, made my heart jolt. I kept my eyes on my mug, hoping neither of them noticed the flush creeping up my neck. Dad smirked, missing the undercurrent completely. Guess I should have had you around when he was a teenager. You got him working harder in 3 days than I did in 20 years. Mark smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Some lessons come late. The rest of breakfast passed in small talk and silence. When my father left for town, the quiet returned in full, heavy as humidity. I went outside to repaint the porch railing, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of the brush strokes. But every few minutes, I'd feel his presence. Behind me, in the doorway or watching from the corner of my eye. Once, I turned and caught him looking. He didn't flinch or look away. He just met my gaze, calm but searching, like he was waiting for me to decide what happened next. By afternoon, I gave up pretending. I went inside to read, but even the words refused to stay still. The house creaked. The air felt thick. Every time I thought I was alone, I'd hear his footsteps somewhere down the hall, measured, deliberate, stopping just before they reached my door. That evening, after dinner, my father opened another beer and announced he was calling it a night. "You two can hold down the fort," he said, waving toward the living room. "Don't burn the place down." When he was gone, the house exhaled again, settling into that uneasy quiet. I was on the couch, book in hand but unread, when Mark walked in. He hesitated for a moment near the doorway, then crossed the room and sat down. Not beside me exactly, but close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. "What are you reading?" he asked. I held up the cover. "Something from the store. Mostly just words to fill space." He nodded. "Sometimes space doesn't need filling." We sat there in that strange half-light, the old floor lamp humming faintly between us. I could hear the clock ticking, the wind brushing against the windows. He leaned back, arms crossed, watching the ceiling. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said suddenly. I looked up. "Who?" He smiled to himself. "Someone who made me believe there was more to life than orders and silence." The words hung there, gentle but dangerous. I swallowed hard. "What happened to them?" He exhaled slowly, eyes still on the ceiling. "They disappeared. Or maybe I did. Sometimes it's the same thing." Something in his tone made my pulse quicken. The air between us changed, thickened, like before a storm. I wanted to ask what he meant, whether he was talking about love or regret or both. But my throat wouldn't form the words. Instead, I just said quietly, "You don't strike me as someone who disappears." That made him look at me. "You'd be surprised what people like me learn to hide." There it was again, that echo from the porch, the same weight in his voice. The silence stretched. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, my pulse in my neck. The light flickered once, dimmed. He shifted, elbows on his knees now, closer than before. The scent of him, soap, wood, faint smoke, filled the air. "You should be careful with people like me," he said softly. "Why?" "Because I forget where the line is." I didn't move. Neither did he. The room felt smaller with every breath. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled. And in that silence, the sound of the rain began again. Faint at first, then steady. It was like the world was repeating itself, reminding us of what we'd left unsaid on the porch. He stood then, as if to end the moment, but his movement was slow, uncertain. "I'm turning in," he said quietly. "Good night," I murmured, though my voice caught halfway. He hesitated at the doorway, then glanced back once. There was something in his eyes, regret, restraint, maybe both. "Sleep well, Evan." When he said my name, it was softer than I'd ever heard it before. I didn't sleep. For hours, I lay staring at the ceiling, the rain tapping at the windows like a persistent thought. I kept replaying every glance, every word, every near touch. It felt like something was trying to surface, something neither of us was brave enough to face. Finally, I got up. The house was dark except for the faint light from the hallway. I stepped out quietly, barefoot, the wooden floor cool beneath my feet. Halfway down the hall, I stopped. Mark was there, standing near the window, hands in his pockets, staring out into the rain. His shoulders were tense, his head bowed slightly. He turned at the sound of my footsteps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was electric, fragile. "I couldn't sleep," I said, voice barely a whisper. Neither could I. The distance between us was barely 2 feet now. Close enough to see the tired lines beneath his eyes, the faint tremor in his breath. It felt inevitable, the pull, the silence, the wanting. "Mark," I began, but my voice faltered. He shook his head once, as if stopping both of us. "This isn't right." The words were almost painful to hear. Not because I didn't know they were true, but because part of me had hoped he'd stopped caring about what was right. "I know," I said quietly. He looked at me then, really looked, and for one fleeting second, everything was there. The want, the fear, the ache. Then he stepped back, into the dark. "Go to bed, Evan." My name again, this time edged with something heavier, almost desperate. I wanted to reach out, to stop him, but I didn't, because even then, even through the pulse pounding in my ears, I understood what he meant. There are lines you can only cross once. He disappeared into his room without another word. The soft click of the door echoed like a closing gate. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rain and the silence it left behind. When I finally went back to my room, the house felt like it was holding a secret too heavy for its walls. And though neither of us said it, I knew what had changed could never be undone. The morning broke bright and windless, a clear sky after days of rain, but it carried that strange hush that always comes before a goodbye. The coffee pot hissed, the old porch boards creaked, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Mark moved around the kitchen without saying a word. A duffel bag sat by the doorway. His boots were polished, jacket folded on the chair. Every small movement looked practiced, too deliberate, too final. "You're leaving?" I asked, even though I already knew. He nodded once. "Heading out this evening. Your dad knows." I tried to keep my voice even. "That was fast." He didn't look up. Was always the plan. Across the table, my father barely reacted. He was flipping through a hardware catalog, muttering about lumber prices. "Mark's driving me into town first," he said. "Need some paint and a few bolts. He'll head out after." Mark gave a faint smile. "Just a couple errands." But even then, I could see it. The way his jaw tightened, the way he kept his hands busy to avoid his eyes meeting mine. The air between us felt stripped bare. Nothing left but silence and the unspoken weight of the night before. When my father finally grabbed his keys and stepped outside, he called over his shoulder, "Back in an hour or two. Don't wreck the place." The sound of the truck starting, gravel crunching, and then quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the ribs. Mark stood by the sink, staring out the window, fingers tapping against the counter. I watched him for a moment before asking, "You were just going to leave without saying anything?" He sighed, still not turning. "It's easier that way." "Easier for who?" He looked at me then. The morning light cut across his face, catching in the faint scar on his cheek. His eyes looked tired, almost wounded. "For everyone," he said softly. "Especially you." I stepped closer. "You don't get to decide what's easier for me." His expression hardened a little, the soldier's mask sliding back into place. "You're too young, Evan. You don't know what you're asking for." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. "Then tell me what you're afraid of." That stopped him. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time, I saw something like fear flicker across his face. Not of me, but of himself. He turned away, resting both hands on the counter as if steadying himself. "You don't understand. I've spent half my life running from things like this, wanting things like this." "Like what?" I whispered. His voice cracked a little. "Things I'm not supposed to want." The silence after that was heavy enough to make the air feel thick. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint rattle of the porch chimes. Mark rubbed a hand over his face, then finally met my eyes. "Since that first night, I've been fighting it. You think I don't see it? The way you look at me? The way I—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I can't do this. Your father trusts me. You're his son. And I'm not a child, I said, stepping forward. My voice was trembling, but not weak. You said it yourself. You called me a young man. His jaw tightened again, conflict tearing across his features. That doesn't make it right. Then don't hurt me, I said quietly. Just be honest. He stared at me for a long time, as if weighing every word he'd ever said against the one he was about to. And then something in him gave way. The dam cracked. He took a slow breath. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment I walked through that door. Every time you looked at me, I told myself to look away. I told myself it was nothing. But it isn't nothing. The words hit me like a pulse. I didn't realize I'd moved until I was standing right in front of him. Then don't pretend it is. His hand came up, hovering near my face, stopping just short of touching. You don't know what this means, he murmured. If we cross this line, it doesn't go away. It never does. I don't want it to, I said. That was all it took. The space between us vanished. His hand cupped the side of my neck, thumb brushing my jaw, and before I could breathe, his lips found mine. It wasn't a hungry kiss. It was hesitant, trembling, full of fear and need all at once. Like two people trying to remember how to feel alive. His breath was warm, his hand shaking just slightly where it held me, as if the weight of the moment was too much to carry. When he pulled back, it wasn't rejection, it was pain. His eyes were wet, his voice breaking. We can't. I swallowed hard. We already did. He closed his eyes, resting his forehead against mine for a second. You don't know what you're doing to me. Yes, I do, I whispered. Because you're doing the same thing to me. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The house was silent except for the sound of our breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The air was electric, fragile, alive. Then he stepped back, putting a full arm's length between us. Evan, he said, voice hoarse. I need you to forget this. I can't. Try. He turned, picking up the duffel from the floor, his movements suddenly sharp, mechanical. The soldier again. The man who built walls faster than he could break them. You can't just walk away from this, I said, following him to the doorway. He stopped, hand on the frame. I have to. Why? Because of him. He shook his head. Because if I stay, I'll stop pretending. And once that happens, there's no going back. I wanted to grab his hand, to make him look at me again. But he wouldn't. His eyes were glassy now, fixed on the door like it was the only safe escape. I'm sorry, he said. You deserve someone who isn't haunted by the past. I felt the words cut through me, slow and deliberate. And you deserve someone who isn't afraid of the present. For the first time, he looked back. There was something almost like a smile. A sad, broken thing that didn't reach his eyes. You'll be all right, he said quietly. You're stronger than you think. I shook my head. Not right now. He didn't answer. He just stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The sound of his boots on the gravel faded quickly. I stood there, still until I couldn't hear anything at all. When my father returned later, I pretended to be reading again. He didn't notice the quiet. He just asked if Mark had already hit the road. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. Good man, Dad said, grabbing a beer. Shame he couldn't stay longer. I managed a small smile. Yeah, shame. That night, the house felt hollow, every creak and breath amplified in the empty rooms. I sat on the porch where it had all begun, the boards cool beneath my bare feet, the scent of rain still clinging to the air. The sky was clear again, stars scattered like distant lights, and somewhere down the road, I imagined the red glow of his taillights disappearing into the dark. I thought of his voice, low, rough, trembling, and the way he'd said my name like it was both a warning and a prayer. I wanted to hate him for leaving, but I couldn't, because for a single, fleeting moment, he'd let me see the truth he'd buried for years. And maybe that was enough. Inside, the clock ticked past midnight. The silence stretched wide and endless. And for the first time since he'd come, the house truly felt empty. Months slipped away quietly, one indistinguishable from the next. The seasons turned, The rain came and went, and the silence in the house stretched longer with each passing day. After Mark left, my father hardly mentioned him again. Maybe it was easier that way for both of us. Sometimes, when he talked about the old days, his tone softened just slightly, and I'd catch the ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But he never said Mark's name, and I never asked. I stayed for a while after that, drifting through the rooms like a shadow. Every nail on the porch, every chair, every mug carried the faint echo of him. His voice, his touch, the warmth he'd left behind. But the longer I stayed, the heavier it became. So one morning, without a plan, I packed a few boxes and moved to the small city 2 hours away. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand reason. I just needed distance. I found a tiny apartment near the bookstore where I worked. It smelled of dust and paper and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to you after hours among shelves. The quiet was different here, less suffocating, more alive. I could walk down a street and be no one to anyone, and that anonymity was its own kind of mercy. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about him. Not the way I used to, no longer the sharp ache of wanting, but something gentler, like remembering a song you once loved. I tried to imagine where he might be. Another town, another porch, another broken thing to fix. I hoped he'd found peace somewhere, in a world big enough to hold it. Then one morning, a thin envelope slipped through my mail slot. No return address, no stamp, just a scrawl of ink that made my heart stop for half a breath. Inside was a postcard. The picture showed an empty road lined with pine trees and a faint horizon of hills. On the back, written in handwriting I knew better than my own, were 5 words. Hope you're doing well. Still fixing things wherever I go. No signature. None needed. I read it until the edges began to curl. Then I tucked it into a book on my nightstand. A quiet promise I wasn't ready to break. When spring came, I went home for the first time in months. My father had gotten older somehow, thinner around the face. The house looked the same, though, frozen in its usual state of half-finished repairs. We ate dinner in mostly silence. He talked about the roof that needed patching, the neighbors who'd sold their farm, the usual nothings. Afterward, I stepped outside for air. The porch had been repainted, the same pale blue Mark had chosen. I ran my hand along the railing, smooth beneath my fingers. The rain started again, light and steady, just like that first night. I was about to go back inside when headlights flickered down the road. A truck slowed near the gate, tires crunching against gravel. For a second, my heart stopped. It was his truck. I'd know that sound anywhere. The low hum, the uneven rattle, the dented fender that caught the light just so. He didn't drive up to the house. He never did. Instead, the engine idled for a moment, then shut off. The driver's door opened, and there he was, older, maybe, but still unmistakably him. He didn't see me right away. He walked to the gate, knelt, and placed something at the base of the fence post. Flowers, fresh, simple, wild. Then he turned to leave. Mark. The word slipped out before I could stop it. He froze. Slowly, he turned toward the porch light, his face catching the glow through the rain. For a moment, neither of us moved. The years between us folded like a page turned back too far. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet from the steps. His hair was shorter now, streaked with more gray, but his eyes, those same steady, searching eyes, hadn't changed. I wasn't sure you'd be here, he said quietly. I wasn't sure you'd come back. He smiled faintly. I didn't. Not really. Just passing through. Flowers for my dad? I asked, though I already knew. Yeah. His voice caught slightly. Didn't seem right to leave without saying something. I nodded. He never stopped respecting you, you know? Even when he stopped talking about you. Mark's jaw flexed, the rain running down his temple. He was a good man. Hard to know, but good. We stood there in silence for a moment, the sound of rain filling the gaps between words. You still fixing things? I asked finally. He chuckled under his breath. Trying to. Not as good at it as I used to be. You fixed enough around here, I said softly. He looked up then, and for a second, I saw it again, the same look he'd given me that night on the porch. A look that stripped everything down to truth. I wanted to write more, he said. Didn't think I should. I got your postcard. That made him smile, tired but warm. Good. I wasn't sure it would find you. The rain thickened, drumming against the steps. I stepped forward, closer to the edge of the porch, the distance between us closing to a single heartbeat. You look well, he said. So do you. He shook his head. Older. Maybe, I said. But still you. His eyes softened. You taught me something, you know? I tilted my head. What's that? That some things don't have to be wrong just because they're not easy. The words hung in the air, warm against the cold rain. I didn't answer. Couldn't. My throat ached too much for speech. He took a slow breath, then nodded toward the flowers by the gate. Those are for your dad. Tell him they're from an old soldier who never forgot what loyalty looked like. I will. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze searching mine. Then softer. Take care of yourself, Evan. You too. He hesitated as if he might say more, then simply touched the brim of his cap in a small, familiar gesture and turned back to his truck. I watched as he started the engine, the headlights cutting through the rain, reflecting off the wet road. When the truck rolled past the bend, I caught a last glimpse of him through the window, his hand resting on the steering wheel, his face half-lit, eyes forward. And then he was gone again. I stood in the rain until the sound faded. Inside, my father was asleep in his chair, the television flickering faint light across his face. I looked at him for a long moment, then glanced out the window toward the road. The flowers by the gate gleamed faintly in the moonlight, each petal glistening with rain. It struck me then, not as loss, not as longing, but as something gentler. Love, I realized, doesn't always end in possession. Sometimes it's the quiet knowing that someone saw you, truly saw you, if only once. That night, as I lay awake in my old room, I thought of that first evening when the door opened and he stepped into our lives, carrying the scent of rain and distance, wearing the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. He had been my father's friend, the man who taught me how to hold a hammer and how to look someone in the eyes without flinching. And maybe he was more than that. I don't know if what passed between us was love or something beyond it. Something wordless, forbidden, fleeting, but real enough to leave a mark that time couldn't wash away. What I do know is this. I'll never forget the night his eyes found mine and never looked away.